Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Insights interviews from Casetext. I'm Mike Whelan here in the WeWork Kansas City studio. In this series, we're talking to our friends about writing and specifically improving your writing craft before you need it. Today, I'm with my buddy Jason Steed. Jason, how are you doing?
I'm swell.
Production note for the watchers. This is literally the third time we've recorded this interview now. So now all of the jokes that we had before sound ridiculous. And now Jason and I are just going to make fools of ourselves. Jason, you were well before today. You're swell. You killed all my grammar jokes. We always like to start with a rant from our interviewees so that the YouTube audience knows this is the most fascinating thing they could possibly listen to today. What do you want to rant about, Jason Steed?
Well, I'm not a ranter, and I have to work myself up for this because it's a rant about legal writing. But my pet peeve that I'm going to start with, and I'm going to channel my Alex Jones and say, stop renaming parties in parentheses with quotation marks. Don't do it.
Yeah, that was really effective. Just keep talking about renaming parties.
My pet peeve, what I'm talking about is sometimes you do need to rename a party because it has a complicated name or something, or a really long name, or what you want to call the party is significantly different, and it might be confusing if you don't. It's different from the real name or the official name or something. And so you need to rename the party to make it clear who it is you're talking about. Sometimes you have to do that. But I'm talking about, stop renaming plaintiff John Smith as Smith. Everybody knows if you say Smith, you're talking about John Smith, unless there are other Smiths. So, if Baylor Medical Center is your party and you want to call them Baylor the rest of the brief, you don't have to put parentheses with quotation marks to say Baylor Medical Center, parentheses, quotation marks, Baylor. You don't have to do that. That's
okay.
That's
the
my
parentheticals. Yeah, this all seems esoteric, but it gets to a larger point that we're going to talk about, which is targeting your writing to the particular purpose, right? It's not you blowing trumpets. There's a purpose to your writing.
Clarity is all you're worried about. And if it's clear already, you don't have to put a bunch of junk in there just because you've seen other people do it.
All right, that was a decent rant. Next time, I want more yelling, and I want some of those graphics from Mad Money that fly in. That's very helpful.
Something that zooms in real close.
Exactly. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to ask about your background. You and I met. You were actually the first person at the University of Texas School of Law that I met in the foyer, and so I blame all my career choices on you.
The atrium.
Yeah, in the atrium. So it's your fault. Tell me about your background. You're kind of a weird dude. Tell me about what happened to you before law school. Why did you do this?
Well, I was a skater as a freshman and sophomore in high school. Pretty serious skate punk dude. And then I growed up to I decided that I wanted to teach. Actually, when I went to my freshman year of college, I majored in political science, and I thought I was going to go to law school and be some kind of environmental or civil rights lawyer, some kind of leftist lawyer kind of thing. And but then I went. I'm a Mormon, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
The correct name.
I went on a mission. And I realized I was pretty good at teaching and actually really enjoyed teaching. And so I came home from my mission and I changed and I went and I did a master's and a PhD in English, in literature and creative writing and taught for several years, taught writing and literature for several years in academia. And then decided that the job market in academia just was terrible, and even if you get a job, you actually don't get paid anything in the English department. They give you my bonus was a leather-bound book, that was which was only just a little more than my salary.
Nice.
So I left academia and went to law school after all, and ended up becoming a lawyer after all. And then with my research and writing academic background, I gravitated very quickly to appellate practice, which is where most of the research and writing is in legal practice.
And now you presented at Lawyer Forward, the conference that I hosted, and I know you've talked to lawyers about legal writing, applying kind of that English professor background to legal writing.
Yeah, I give presentations pretty regularly on legal writing for either CLE presentations for bar associations, or I've gone in-house to clients or potential clients and given presentations to in-house lawyer groups about legal writing, that sort of thing.
So, and maybe a weird way to approach this, a lot of the interviews so far have been more, I don't want to say in the clouds, but a little more strategy, a little more background, kind of general principles. In this conversation, since I've got somebody with a red pen, I'm going to be asking you for some tips. And you had sent me 5, some big principles that you want lawyers to remember in their writing. So if you don't mind, we'll go through those and you can expound as much as you want, as long as you're yelling and there are whooshy graphics. Is that cool?
Okay.
All right. So let's start for number 1. Use bold for emphasis rather than italics. This is nerdy. Tell me more.
I mean, this is this is one of those things that we fight over on Twitter among legal writing professors and appellate lawyers and stuff like that. It's a typography issue, how you use font and type in your writing. And I think traditionally people have used italics for emphasis. And that's great. That's fine. What we're talking about here is how do you emphasize a certain word, or maybe it's a sentence. I actually would recommend against emphasizing an entire sentence, but basically, there are times you want to draw the reader's eye to a word or a phrase or a sentence, and make it stand out. And I think traditionally people have used italics for that. I am not a fan of using italics for emphasis, and it's because we use italics for other things. We use italics for case names. We use italics for the titles of other things, like book titles sometimes. We use italics for Latin phrases. So because we use italics for other things, I prefer doing something else for emphasis. I prefer bold for emphasis. We use bold typically in legal writing. We use it typically for headers. But the reason we bold headings and headers is because we're emphasizing that it's a heading or a header. So some people will say, well, I don't want to use bold for emphasis because I think bold's really only appropriate for headings. But that's what you're doing when you bold a heading, is you're emphasizing that it's a heading and not the body of the text. So I like bold for emphasis for that reason. And the other thing too is you want to use syntax and sentence structure and the way you organize your writing grammatically or syntactically. You want to use that to create emphasis as much as possible anyway. You don't want to use typeface for emphasis any more than you have to. So, putting important words at the end of the sentence or at the beginning and end, those are places that are natural rhetorical places of emphasis. So you do things like that and use rhythm and flow to create emphasis. So using typeface, you want to do that as little as possible. And one of the things I like about bold for emphasis is when you look at a page, if you've got 11 bolded words on the page, that will hopefully encourage you to de-emphasize some of those words, not use so much typeface for emphasis. And since you want to do that as little as possible anyway, the fact that bold really stands out and really emphasizes, I think, encourages you to do it sparingly, which is what you want to do anyway. So that's my pitch for using bold for emphasis instead of italics.
Yeah, one of the themes that
many Twitter battles have been fought over this.
The Twitter battles, that's where it's at. I get paid to get in Twitter fights. One of the themes that's come up in these interviews is that lawyers tend to try to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. And we've talked about that in terms of evidence, right? Like giving just the cases, right? Throwing out all these citations in hopes that something moves a judge. But obviously the net effect of that is that the judge doesn't see a single citation. You're doing the same with this use of typography, saying use it less in order to have more impact, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. The more you use typeface to emphasize something, the less effective it is. Because if everything's emphasized, then nothing is emphasized. So, that's a big part of it. Use it as little as possible, so that when you do use it, it really does jump out. And I also would throw in, only use whatever you use, even if you're a fierce adherent to italics for emphasis. That's fine. It's really just a stylistic choice. There's not a right or wrong. The only thing that I would say absolutely across the board do not do is do not use more than one typeface adjustment to create emphasis. Don't do italics and bold. Don't do bold, italics, underlined. Don't all caps, bold. I should do that. All caps, bold, italics. No.
Clearly, you've learned nothing from Twitter, because all caps. That's the magic.
No. Never. And actually, if we're talking about typography, never use all caps. Like never. Not anywhere in your document should there be all caps. Maybe I'm talking about litigation. Maybe in contracts. I think that there actually are statutes or regulations that require certain things to be emphasized in a contract through bold all caps or something like that. I mean, if you're required by law to use it in some piece of legal writing, then I guess you should. But in litigation, there shouldn't be all caps anywhere. All caps is really hard to read. It's really ugly looking. If you need to have all caps, do the small caps instead of the all caps. But yeah, just one typeface change to create emphasis. Pick the one that you like the best. I prefer bold.
So speaking of visual layout on a document, another kind of nerdy point that you made to me, another Twitter argument is to use ragged right margins rather than justified, both left and right. Why?
It's a readability thing. So I know that, and this is it's a stylistic choice. There's not a right or wrong. And I know when you look at the page overall, everybody really likes that blocky look that the justified margins has, that nice square block of text. And it does, that looks really pretty. But the readability, there are a lot of studies that are done about readability. And when you have a justified margin, it has to vary the space between words and letters in order to get that nice, clean right-hand margin on the justified right-hand margin. And because the spacing between words and letters has to be varied in order to get that straight right margin, it makes your eyes work harder to read across the letters and words. And so the studies say that a ragged right margin where you can have consistent spacing between words and letters, it makes your margin ragged, but the spacing for words and letters is consistent, and that's much easier on your eyes, and it's much easier to read. And to go with this, I would also add you want bigger margins on both sides. 1 inch margin tends to be the default, but again, all the studies say that the shorter your line length is, the easier it is to read. So if you can do 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 or 1 3/4 even, obviously you got to follow whatever the actual court rules are if there's a rule about it. But if you can get bigger margins to give you shorter lines, that's much easier to read. And by the way, the reason you want easier to read is because the more readable it is, that improves retention and comprehension. And you want the judge or whoever it is that's reading your piece of writing, you want them to comprehend and retain what you wrote. And so better readability aids comprehension and retention. So shorter line lengths is better. And the ragged right margin is better for readability, even if it's not as pretty as the block of text. Now you can do things. I don't like a lot of hyphenating. You can do this for the justified margin or the ragged right margin. For the justified margin, if you want to reduce the varied spacing in the words and letters, you can turn on the hyphenating so that there's enough hyphenating with words to create a more consistent spacing for the justified margin. And that helps. Or if you're doing the ragged right margin, you can turn on the hyphenating so that you get a little bit less ragged margin, because it'll be able to fit more text on each line so that it evens out the margin. And that's fine too if you want that and need that. I don't like a lot of hyphenating because that actually, when you're hyphenating, you're breaking words in half, and that's harder to read. So I don't like to do that a whole lot. I'm totally okay with the ragged right margin, even if it looks really ragged. So that's my stylistic preference, but there are those other things you can do if there's something that you really prefer.
So to add layers of controversy, I read an interview recently with Justice Scalia in which he said if he sees one more contraction, he's going to go crazy. You like the contractions because you're a contrary guy. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, Scalia is was very much the traditionalist on usage and grammar and writing and all that kind of stuff. And traditionally, contractions are seen as informal. That's not really that's the traditional view, but that's not really borne out by like the evidence, because there's all kinds of formal writing that contains contractions throughout history, like going back hundreds of years. Very formal writing has contained contractions. So the traditional view that contractions are informal is really it's misconceived, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of very traditional people who have very traditional views still tend to think that. But you can find many court opinions, both Supreme Court opinions and Court of Appeals opinions, where the courts have used contractions in their written opinions. And I'm not a fan of contractions in the sense that, like, I think you just should use them all the time everywhere. It's moderation. What I think is most important when we're talking about contractions, what I think is the overarching concern, is you want to have a nice sense of rhythm and flow in your writing. You want it to, if you were reading it out loud, you want it to sound nice. And because when you're reading silently, your inner ear hears the writing in your head, and so you want it to have a nice rhythm and flow to it. And sometimes using a contraction aids that rhythm and flow. That is how that sentence just feels like it ought to sound. And so I'm not saying use contractions as much as possible. I advocate not being afraid of using contractions. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not informal. It's perfectly acceptable, and it will aid the creation of a rhythm and flow that you want, that where the writing sounds good. So it's not so much I'm pushing contractions. It's more just don't be afraid of them. And traditional.
And often your contractions are apostrophe S's and apostrophe REs because you're using a lot of to be verbs, which it's a cliche at this point to stop doing that.
Yeah, I mean, to be verbs, the biggest problem with to be verbs, I think, is just that it possibly indicates passive voice. And so that's where the to be verbs get problematic, is you might be using passive voice where you didn't mean to be. And passive voice is okay if you meant it for reasons, but if you were not intentionally trying to do passive voice for a good reason, then you probably want active voice. And the to be verb is a good signal to you that, oh, maybe I used passive voice there. To be verbs, aside from passive voice, they can be problematic just because they're not super vivid verbs. And if that's, there may be a better verb that you could be using. But
yeah, let me transition you to, because you had, one of your tips was to think more about nouns and verbs, which is relevant to this. So tell me about your thoughts on nouns and verbs.
Yeah, those are nouns and verbs are the words that do the work in your writing. And so you want to pay a lot of people, a lot of less experienced writers think that the way you juice up your writing is by adding adjectives and adverbs. So, it's not the door, it's the tall red door, and that's going to make it so much better. But adverbs and adjectives a lot of times are, if you're using an adjective to modify your noun, you might not have the best noun if it needs to be modified. If you're using an adverb to modify your verb, you might not have the best verb if it needs modification. So I usually encourage people to think really hard about the noun and verb that you're using. They do the work, and I usually I go through this example, and it's much easier, better with a visual, and I don't have the visual I can fly in, and but the example I use a lot is you can take three sentences that are just subject, verb, object. In other words, two nouns and a verb, basically, with a little bit. But if you take the sentence, the man struck the girl, and then you ask everybody, you're a decision maker and you have to choose sides. Whose side are you on? 99% will say, oh, I'm on the girl's side. That doesn't sound so good if the man is striking the girl. And then you take another sentence and you say, the parent spanked the child, and you're a decision maker. Whose child are you on? Or I mean, whose side are you on? And it's usually split. Like, the audience will half will say, the parent, half will say, the child. Actually, most will say, I kind of need more information. I'm not sure whose side I'm on there. And then if you take another sentence that says, the guard subdued the thief, and you're the decision maker, whose side are you on? And 99% of people will say, well, I'm on the guard side. But those three sentences can be describing, if you imagine a scenario like a mall, and one of those earring, trinket bracelet earring stores at the mall, 2 or 3 13-year-old girls come walking out of there, and the person at the store has called the security guard because one of the girls has stolen some earrings out of this trinket store at the mall. And the security guard comes running around the corner and he grabs the girl, and then in that moment realizes it's his daughter and gives her a swift swat on the rear, because he's just caught his own daughter stealing at the mall. Those three sentences, the man struck the girl, the parent spanked the child, the guard subdued the thief. Those three sentences can be eyewitness statements about what they saw happen, but using the right noun or verb, or the noun verb combination. As a legal writer, I'm just presenting factual observations, but I can get you to change sides as the decision maker, because the man struck the girl, you're on the girl's side, and the guard subdued the thief, you're on the guard's side. And those are different sides. And in some situations, maybe I don't want you to pick a side. It's more complicated than that. And if I say the parent spanked the child, people are like, I don't know whose side to be on with that. And that's just a really kind of microcosmic example of how just focusing on the right nouns, the right verbs, without a bunch of flowery adjectives and adverbs, you can really persuade the reader to lean one way or another on how you tell the story. And when you lay out just in your statement of facts, choosing the right nouns and the right verbs can do a lot of persuasive work without getting flowery with other stuff.
So on the last tip, tell me about the phrase, the instant case, or the case at bar. Why does that bug you so much?
You just stop doing that. The instant case, the case at bar. What are the other ones? There's 2 or 3 others that people use in litigation. You're talking about this case, like this case that we're arguing right now, this case that we're in right now. And I think it's just, there's some of those sort of archaic traditional phrases that get used, the case at bar. First of all, most of the time you either have a page count or a word count that you're up against. This case is shorter than the case at bar or the instant case. Just stop using archaic, awkward stuff. Nobody talks like that. And if you wouldn't talk like that in a conversation with some other person who's a non-lawyer, then stop talking like that in your brief or your motion. It's just ridiculous. I just say this case. That's all you gotta
say. You're applying this is writing, not legal writing kind of logic. And
it's plain language kind of principles, right? So I do think like there is a distinction between legal writing and regular writing, because legal writing is doing, it's a subset of regular writing. But so I think it's legit to talk about legal writing as a thing. but we can still embrace plain language principles, and there's no reason legal writing needs to sound ridiculous compared to other writing. It is doing something that other writing isn't necessarily doing. So it's operating in a context that general writing's not operating in, but that doesn't mean it has to sound stupid. It can sound like regular writing. I regularly will give my motion or brief to my wife, who's a non-lawyer, and ask her to read it and tell me if it makes sense. And
I bet she loves that.
Actually, she doesn't mind it at all. Some of the cases are interesting, right? But I won't make her read a 60-page brief. But if I have I'm trying to make this concept or this argument make sense, and so I have here's 3 pages where I'm trying to just explain this thing. Can you tell me if this makes sense? And of course, there are certain terms. That's part of why legal writing is a thing. It's not regular writing. There are terms or concepts that she might not. She doesn't get what that means. Or there's a standard of review that obviously she's not familiar with. But if she can, if a non-lawyer, if an intelligent non-lawyer can understand what you're saying because you put it plainly enough for them to understand it, then that's what you want. You don't want only lawyers steeped in archaic, ridiculous sounding lawyer language. You don't want those to be the only people who can understand what you wrote.
Yeah. So to get to maybe shorter form Q&A, a little more hot seaty, you keep writing short stories. Why do you do this?
I don't know. Writing's just a thing I do. And so I really enjoy, there are parts of being a lawyer I don't enjoy, but I really enjoy the writing part of being an appellate lawyer. That's why that's the practice area that I moved into, because I enjoy writing. But I also enjoy writing when I'm not having to write. So yeah, I continue to write sometimes. I don't get as much time as I would like to have to write things that I'm not having to write.
Well, speaking of time, I wanted to ask you, for one of the things that I've argued in this series is that for our audience, which is mostly kind of solo small lawyers, we're not writing as a daily thing, but by the time we get to it, we have to be good at it, right? And so for those lawyers that are really crunched for time but aren't writing every day, how would you suggest that they might improve their writing craft before it's time to use it?
Read a lot of good writing. That's the biggest thing. Read good writing. You will absorb good writing habits and practices by reading. You might not have to write something every day, or you might not even have to write something every week. Maybe you're not even writing any kind of sustained piece of writing. Maybe you're not even doing that more than once a month. So I mean, you can sort of get out of practice with good writing, but you're reading stuff probably every day, and so, or if not, a few times a week at least. So just try, when you have choices about what you read, try to read good writing, and that means if it's magazine news related stuff, read the New Yorker or the Atlantic or Harper's or the Economist or other. That's good writing for the most part. If you like books, if you read books, then pick good authors, good writers, people who are recognized as good writers. Just read good writing, and that will.
So last
do a ton.
Question was,
and then
about resources. Obviously, as an English professor, you were using a lot of recommended text for students. Hey, this will teach you how to write. If I'm sitting down and I'm doing work, what kind of tools should I have around me, whether software or grammar books or whatever? What do you think is just essential?
For writing, so writing references.
Sure.
Or
What
things like
tools
that?
in
Is that
general? If you're
what you
sitting
mean?
down to get after a brief, what's on your desk?
Well, I mean, I think um, I've been writing so much for so long that I don't have ready writing references that I turn to very frequently. But for younger or less experienced writers, or when I do need to turn to something. So we were talking about typography earlier. I really recommend Typography for Lawyers by Matthew Butterick, which is really good about that visual kind of stuff with typography. For actual writing, there's that Writing with Style, which is good. There's a lot of, actually, you know what I would recommend is there are a lot of books aimed more at writing in general, writing, creative writing, and that sort of stuff. There's the one, and the title of it is escaping me. It's something, I think it has something with bird or birds in the title. But go look at creative writing books. Like if you just want to read books about writing, then I would say you can start busting out of the legal writing and look at writing more broadly.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of
and books
Stephen
about
King's
good
book
writing.
on writing, both because reading it is a good experience, but also he's pulling a lot of these principles out in a way that is way more compelling than reading a blank for lawyers book that tells you about writing.
Yeah, it is good. I was just trying to see, I've got a little shelf behind my laptop. I'm trying to see if I have a couple of the books.
I just want to point out, I've seen way more close-ups of you in this conversation than I'm comfortable with. Okay.
I'm trying to see what's on my shelf here. There's writing, The Elements of Style, Strunk and White is good. I've got that one. What else?
This is really compelling television. I see your buttons right now. This is the good stuff, YouTube.
Yeah. I can't really see it. I can't really see it very well. But yeah, Stephen King's book is good. There's one.
Are you talking about Anne Lamott's book?
It's got bird or birds or something.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it
Maybe
either.
that's it.
Something flies
What's
away
that
or something. But yeah, Anne Lamott's book where she's talking about writing as well. Those books where legit writers are talking about here's the craft. When Stephen King says to you, say said, don't say said vehemently. If you use said vehemently, it means the sentence you just wrote that your character said wasn't very clear. You're using vehemently to bail you out of the fact that you didn't write a good sentence. So yeah, and he talks about that on.
And that's actually the exact point I'm making about the focus on your nouns and verbs and not the adjectives and adverbs stuff. But yeah, so I did a master's of fine arts in creative writing and read a ton of those books about writing and books by writers about writing. And I recommend just do that. Go to the bookstore and just look for the section on writing. And there's Stephen King's book. There's Anne Lamott's book. There's a lot of books by good writers who've published and written lots of stories and novels and memoirs and other things. And I recommend, read those. If you want to read a book about writing, read those books. The books on legal writing, Wayne Sheese has a book about writing. It's something like Writing for the Legal Audience or something like that. You know, if you want to actually focus on the context of legal writing, because it is a different thing, then there are some books. Sheese's book is good. Garner, Garner's always good. I don't know that he has his books, I think, tend to focus more on kind of some of what we were talking about, the piece by piece kind of stuff, as opposed to bigger picture stuff, I think. Unless maybe
I just do whatever Sheese tells me. That's like my life rule. Just do what she says.
Yeah, Sheese is good. Guberman's the Point Made. I think that's Point. He's got two. I think it's Point Made and Point Taken. I'm trying to look at my bookshelf again. But Guberman's Point Made, he does a good job of taking examples, lots of really good examples from briefs or judicial opinions, examples of good writing to sort of model what good legal writing can look like. So there's a lot out there like that. But really, like I said, I mean, read good writing. Just about other stuff, because sometimes people don't want to read writing about writing. But if you read good writing and read it with the eye of a writer, like, man, that was a really great article. Go back and look at it and say, how did they put that together? How did they make that article happen? How did they get from that paragraph to the next paragraph? Look at what transitions they used. How did they, that paragraph, brought tears to my eyes. It was so moving. How did they do that? Because it's not just the content, it's how they delivered the content to you is what moved you. So with the eyes of a writer, go back and look, like, what was their opening sentence? How did they get from that sentence to the next sentence? How did they get from that paragraph to the next paragraph? Look at those things, look at the writing like a writer, and you don't have to read writing about writing to learn how to be a better writer from it. You can just read good writing about anything.
Well, a lot of
but read
legal
it as a
briefs
writer.
Bring tears to my eyes for different reasons, and you probably shouldn't duplicate those. For people, Jason, I appreciate you. For people who want to follow up with you and pick your brain about their writing and ask your wife to read their stuff, what's the best way to reach out to you?
You can email me at jsteed at kilpatricktownsend.com, or you can follow or message or reply to me on Twitter. I'm at Fifth Circ Appeals, which is 5THCIRCAPPEALS. So Twitter or email are probably the best ways to get a hold of me. And I'm always happy to answer questions about writing or talk about writing or get in a Twitter fight with you about writing. That's the good stuff.
All right, brother. I appreciate you. And thank you to everyone for watching these Insights interviews from Casetext. Make sure you check out the rest of these on the playlist in this series on improving your writing craft. Thank you.